Welcome to The Teaching Curve, a podcast exploring the pedagogy of global politics and international studies. Produced under the auspices of the International Studies Association and made available through ISA's Professional Resources Center. I'm Jamie Free, Associate Provost and Professor of Global Politics at Bridgewater College. Each episode of The Teaching Curve is a conversation with thoughtful and engaged teachers of international studies. The goal is to celebrate and inspire pedagogical creativity by facilitating conversations that connect instructors from around the world and thereby explore both similarities and differences in how we teach global politics. The context of teaching matters because ultimately teaching is about communicating. Hearing how others think deeply about their context can help us explore how teaching is influenced by the similarities of what we teach and by the differences required by whom we teach. Today's conversation is with Dr. Jochen Kleinschmidt, Research Associate and Coordinator of the Center for Latin American Studies at Catholic University in Eichstätt-Ingolstadt in Germany, and Dr. Margaryta Rymarenko, a scholar currently working with humanitarian organizations in Kyiv, Ukraine. Jochen taught IR at two different institutions in Colombia from 2014 to 2020, and Margaryta taught IR at the University of Yangon in Myanmar in 2017. Together, they are co-authors of a forthcoming chapter on teaching IR theory as visitors to classrooms in the Global South. Our conversation explores the role of teachers in empowering students, both generally and when teaching in cultures other than our own. Problems that accompany the simplifications built into terms like Global South and Global North, and processes for helping students connect their personal experiences to the types of knowledge particular to the study of IR and global politics. Margaryta Rymarenko and Jochen Kleinschmidt, welcome to The Teaching Curve. So glad you are here today.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, excited to be here.
One of the reasons that I want to talk to you is because I've read a chapter that you both co-authored about what it's like to be a person from the global north who goes to teach in areas that are in the global south. And of course, we want to problematize and put little quotations around these terms, because one of the things that you do very well in the piece that I read is complicate some of those terminologies. Margaryta, why don't you start telling us a little bit about where you are now and the experience that you had that you recorded in the chapter that you wrote.
Okay, so I'm currently in Kyiv. I have a mixed career. I work for INGO, still in education. I work a lot with teachers, with organizations who support education during war in Ukraine. And I actually use a lot of my experience teaching in this diverse context, like Myanmar and some other places, also now in my own country. And back then I was first time experiencing Global South in quotation marks in 2017. I was a student myself back then working on my PhD. My research was related to Asia, namely ASEAN. And this opportunity to go teach in a university in one of ASEAN countries was very attractive to me. To be honest, really, I was stepping into unknown terrain, but I was, of course, very excited. I also like teaching, so I was really hyped with this opportunity. I was also recently taking, at the time, excellence in teaching in higher education course. So, of course, I was passionate to try out all the new tools and techniques and pedagogical approaches I was studying. So I kind of came with really enthusiastic idea that, of course, I will go and change the world for these young people whom I'm going to teach. But of course, when I arrived there, the reality hit me very hard, and I had to be very reflective, critically reflective about the mindset I came with and what I have observed when I arrived. And through the conversations with the colleagues in the department in Yangon University and with students as well, I had to become very humble about my own persona and about the people I was going to collaborate with. So that kind of started me on a very new mindset about what I was doing in Myanmar, but also later on as I was becoming a teacher myself, a proper faculty member, that shaped a lot how I was thinking about stuff later on.
That's fantastic. Jochen, What about you? What's your story?
Yes, it's very different. I went to Colombia, first to Medellin for 2 years, and then to Universidad del Rosario in Bogota. In 2014, after finishing my PhD at Munich University in Germany, I already spoke Spanish. I had already been studying the conflict with organized crime organizations in Mexico, so I was used in a way to a Latin American environment. And I just decided, okay, instead of doing a postdoc in some place in Germany or Great Britain or wherever, I'm going to go to Colombia and actually work where my research is going to take place anyway. So I went there and worked in a very different environment, obviously, from a German political science faculty, because besides being in Medellin, also that was a business school environment where the idea would be I would sort of give some geopolitical context to future managers of export-driven companies in Western Colombia. I then went on to work first as an assistant professor, later as an associate professor at Universidad del Rosario in Bogota, which is a leading political science institution in Latin America. That university is also a very traditional elite building institution that has produced roughly half of all Colombian presidents.
Margaryta, talk to me a little bit about the students you got a chance to meet in Myanmar.
Yeah, I think to some extent the university I was based in and some of the context was a bit similar to what Jochen was talking about in terms of the fact that I was based in the University of Yangon, which is the oldest and the most renowned in the country. I was there in 2017, which was already some time into the democratic transition. Of course, the atmosphere at the time was very much optimistic. The whole society was mobilizing about the idea of democratic transition of the country, building like institutions of democracy. And that also reflected very much in the student body and in the faculty as well at the university. So I was in the Department of International Relations and Political Science, which was a very particular case, because during the military dictatorship back like before 2011, this department was barely existent. Most of the IR and political science disciplines were banned from being taught to students. So the students I got to teach were actually the first cohort of students of BA and MA level who got accepted to this discipline in this at the time. So most of them were also, since the university is mostly very well known and quite elite in local terms, they were all also linked to all sorts of politically affiliated families. Some of them were affiliated with the families of the military junta as well. Some of them were affiliated with the families of the very renowned political dissidents or activists. So it was quite a mixture of personalities there, and they all were very much active themselves as a youth, in youth activism in all sorts of groups and communities, and they were all very much associating themselves with this kind of trajectory, thinking of themselves, as I talked to them in the first class when we met, that all of them thought that they are the ones who are to shape the future of the country, to lead into the democratic process in whatever kind of trajectory they choose. And so there was like a lot of this citizen level, but also initial political level analysis that they had about what was happening in their country, how they think about it, what they make out of it, and trying to kind of make sense as young experts in a country going through the transition. What is they who are going to do something about this story? What are their role in all of this process? And that also somehow shaped their perspective that me coming as a teacher from the global north, let's call it this way, would be the one who is to inform them and guide them in terms of what is it that they have to do. So they had this very kind of straightforward understanding that especially also maybe rooted a little bit in a local culture of very much deep respect to the teachers or any kind of leaders, that the teacher has the right to the ultimate truth, and we are here to follow and learn and kind of step into the path that the teacher is supposed to show us. So that was very much the context I found myself in. And of course, I had to work very hard to shift it around and to make it on a more sort of equal interaction. So it's not just me preaching to a group of young people, oh, you should do this, you should do that, and that's how you're supposed to think about things, but rather encouraging them with all this activism that I had in mind, with all that kind of citizen level perspectives about their country, to sort of reconnect it into more of academic debates that we could have in the classroom.
That's incredible. Jochen, you must have had some of that too, especially going to a business school first and then transitioning into, you said, students that were mostly from elite families. And I'm interested both in how your educational background gave you some authority, but also like your worldliness of being from somewhere else might have affected how the students perceived what you were going to bring to them.
That is something that you will find. I've talked to colleagues from different Latin American countries, but also from India and the Middle East about this. In many different contexts in the Global South, hierarchies are much steeper. As a teacher, you really have a certain amount of power, especially over those students who are getting financial assistance, because very often the students getting financial assistance will require just a simple grade average in order to qualify. And without that financial assistance, students from outside Bogota would generally not be able to afford this in very many cases, because studying at a private university is very expensive. So there is a lot of power in the classroom generally. In Western universities, we can, to a certain degree, shut the door and say, okay, we're here talking about these hopefully interesting intellectual issues. And in the Global South, that is generally not the case. You can pretend, but it's not going to be of much use. Might be because when I came to Colombia, it was in a similar period of transition, as Margaryta just described, with the peace process of La Habana and the decades-long armed conflict in Colombia just ending. And of course, many hopes were then tied to this process, and there was generally this idea that Colombia would somehow interact differently with the world after this peace process, and that is something that is very much present in classroom debates, in the teaching of IR in general.
So, Jochen, did you feel your Germanness in that authority? Did it give you a boost? Did it kind of pull things back? How did your identity as someone from Germany and the global North affect how you think that relationship played out in the class?
Not that much in the classroom, in the sense of necessarily being an authority on the world that is relevant to students. I was perceived, of course, as an authority on European issues, but for example, in terms of IR and IR theories, actually, very often there's this moment of having to justify how is this knowledge relevant to our situation at this time? Are you not just some spaceship landing here and telling us those exotic things that may be different to Europeans? And so there is maybe some authority in some way that you gain by being from abroad. Also, what gave me at some point in time a lot of like recognition was having traveled to different areas having been in the Middle East, for instance, which is relatively rare. That would you said worldliness, so that was recognized as an important experience more than it would be in a Western context, perhaps. And the thing is that what you have to justify is not just classical IR theories like realism, liberalism, and so on, but very much also ideas that we would identify with the global south. For example, post-colonial, decolonial theories. Those are not, interestingly, perceived as being necessarily relevant to what goes on in Colombia. And if you look at where many of those post-colonial theories come from, they were actually designed at universities in the United States by people with an immigration background, but it's not necessarily the case that post-colonial or decolonial theories will be perceived as our approach.
Margaryta, I was fascinated when you said before that, of course, the students in your classroom in Myanmar were getting used to the very idea of what we might consider a more normal university level education, getting out and helping them think about things as opposed to just kind of absorbing the pearls of wisdom that were dripping from your lips as you told them how the world was. Can you talk a little bit about the process for doing that and how it went?
Yeah, but first I wanted to reflect a little bit on something Jochen said, because I think it's also very relevant to the situation in which I was placed in Myanmar. I think the interesting story is that, and it also links to the process, like your question about the process, like how do you do that if you are perceived as a person of ultimate authority and you don't want to be that, because it immediately like creates this hierarchy again, that you are this white lady from Europe coming and preaching to students who have never ever in their life been exposed to anybody outside of Asian context, maybe, or to a very limited extent, maybe. And they themselves haven't also traveled much because they are very young. And also the country was closed for a long period of time. So very few visitors actually foreigners were allowed to interact with them. So in this regard, I think my approach to teaching was, or to also thinking about theoretical concepts, IR ideas, and all these kind of frameworks, is that I don't think there was any need to justify anything. Actually, I didn't want to justify anything to them, because who am I to tell them they're supposed to learn these theories or that theories or think this and that arguments and make some conclusions about them. Actually, my approach was more of a bottom-up story. I never presented any theories to them. We started actually from their lived experiences and the context in which they were set. And we were just analyzing this context as they were thinking about it. So I gave them merely more like a methodological or think process tools to reflect about that. And only then we started to link it where possible to the theoretical concepts that were already existent. As all of you know, most of them were already Western focused or Western products of a Western global North thought, for that matter. So in this regard, I found this to be a very interesting exercise when they were on the one hand, really adopting things from these theories or recognizing some patterns or arguments that they would themselves validate to the context in which they were present, right? And at the same time, there were also examples when they could disprove or question many things, again, based on the history of their context or what they were, the examples that they had in their context, that would kind of even come as a surprise to them, that they say, oh, like, this stuff is not true for us, like maybe there's something wrong with it. Or so it was not like they were speaking to authority in this regard in a version of a theory or an important author or an article, but they were like this creatively exploring, okay, that's what we have read in this text, and that's what we know from where we are. So it doesn't seem to fit very well. So how do we now go from here? So that's why I try to encourage as much as possible. There's more of a bottom-up thing, first coming from their lived experience and their context, and only then talking about the text, the theories, and stuff like that. And sometimes it worked very well, sometimes not so much. So there were also cases when I had to really present to them a framework or a concept, because otherwise they wouldn't have even any language to hit to connect to what they were thinking about. In this regard, yeah, they started to do this kind of a classic application of theory to what they were knowing, or to the cases that I also presented to them from other contexts. That was also like a very nice exercise, and that's what we also described in an article, I believe, to some extent, how you can use these cases as a way of inducting somebody into the discipline. But this other part where they had the opportunity to play around their own context and then grasp if the theory is true for them, or if they kind of sometimes came up with their complete other story and rewrote basically some of the concepts completely in a different way, with very brilliant evidence, I was like, okay, maybe that should be a new theory. Why not? You are just the same IR thinkers as I am. You have the full power to challenge, to create. It's your knowledge production here. You are now offering something into the field yourself. So it's same valid as what I say. And I think towards the end of the semester, they actually gained this really strong confidence of not being this kind of shy novice people who, when you say IR theory to them, they immediately feel like tense and scared and like, oh my God, this is something like Jochen said, like some space shuttle, like whatever, has nothing to do with us. But towards the end, they were like, no, actually, everybody can do theory. We can do theory. We did it in the class, so we can offer something as well. And that was a very nice thing to observe.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm hoping for my students in rural Virginia, is to walk out of an experience with that kind of sense of engaged empowerment.
Absolutely. And if I may, to just pick up something that Margaryta just said, what I really took home from working in Colombia for 7 years is that the way you read things can also work out differently depending on what your experience is. And you can have people read classics in IR, let's say Kenneth Waltz, and come away with lessons that are 100% different from what your IR standard reading of the text is, but it's still entirely valid and coherent and an entirely legitimate reading of the text. Like we would read texts on neorealism, anarchic systems, and so on and so on. But to my students in Bogota, mostly the story would not be so much about anarchical relations between poles, but about the hierarchy between the poles and the non-poles, so to speak, the non-great powers, and so on. So, which is something which is entirely there in the text. If you read the actual theory in a different context, it becomes, it really switches some of its main contents, which is such an interesting process to be part of.
I think the other part of the story also to continue is also, I'm not sure it has to do with the global South and global North, but more to the way how we are introduced and taught the discipline itself. Like we are from the global North, we also, when we are exposed to IR theories, and usually we go through a lengthy training in a field, right? We kind of consume a lot of other people's perspectives on how the theory should be interpreted through various research articles and whatnot, and conferences, and listening to like big guys in the field. So we maybe subconsciously adopt a lot of right thinking or mainstream thinking about how the field itself developed. And it's also probably a reason why most people prefer to teach realism than liberalism than constructivism, kind of in a sequential way of how the field itself evolved. So even by training, we adopt a certain frame, and sometimes we cannot see outside of this frame just by the fact that we were trained to think in a particular way about the field and the particular kind of arguments in that. Versus in case when you talk to somebody who has not been introduced to such a framework and has this opportunity of fresh viewer, of fresh mindset. And we were like, I don't know, Jochen, how long you were teaching. I was teaching only for 1 semester. So in 1 semester, it is impossible to like inject people into all the same training I, for example, went through to adopt a mindset about IR, right? So in this case, the fact that they are free from these preset ideas, but they have other like their own or maybe intuitive ideas about things, creates this room or window for very creative interpretation of things that we would otherwise think as common sense or very well established, and there's no need even to question them because, come on, like how would you question Waltz, or I don't know, it's like very, very set in stone, so to say. But, and I think this is true also not only for people in the global south, but generally, like that's why I like to teach bachelor students so much, because they're much more creative and much more confident in questioning things that people who have longer training in the discipline don't feel so confident to question, just because you're already get into the mindset of how you imagine the discipline should be. So that's why I think it worked so nicely in a way.
I think that is an excellent point, and honestly, it's a great point to end on, except for one thing, and that's what I would like to say is that, you know, both of you were talking about being in societies that were in transitions and kind of mixed up. And I think we have to acknowledge that, Margaryta, you are in one of those right now, and that just want you to know that we're sending you our best to sort of the work that you're doing and the difficult circumstances that you're under. And thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us, both of you. I really appreciate the opportunity to hear these perspectives and to get them out so that people know a little bit about what's going on out there when in your circumstances. So
yeah, thank you very much, Jamie. But I think it's also true for the countries in which we were present. Like Myanmar rolled back immensely after the coup. So I also feel like the people with whom I interact even now, they still kept these perspectives, but also the context in which they are changed sharply, so they're not able to exercise any of the bright ideas and plans they had when I was teaching them. And on the other hand, in Ukraine, you are very right, it's a harsh transition, and it's very open now what kind of a country it is going to be after the war. So we are now completely in limbo about that as well, and I even don't know how it will look like. So that is to be seen. But thanks a lot.
So yeah, thank you both for sharing your experiences with the audience and with me. It's been a really interesting conversation. I wish I could keep talking to you for another hour about these things. You guys have real insights, and it's been powerful. With that, I hope we get to meet each other sometime soon and to continue those conversations in a different context. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Margaryta.
The Teaching Curve podcast is made available in video and audio-only versions at the Professional Resource Center of the International Studies Association. Audio versions can be found on all major podcast platforms. You can send feedback or suggestions for future interviews to teachingcurve@isanet.org. And follow us on X, Twitter, or whatever it's called today, @TeachingCurve. Thank you for joining us again on the Teaching Curve, especially after a summer hiatus. And remember, learn something every time you teach.